Hello, everyone. Welcome to Art of the MOOC guest presentations. We have today a very, very interesting curator who has been working all over the US, including Puerto Rico. And welcome, Marcela Guerrero. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Pedro.
Like I was saying before, I think you've worked in not just East Coast, West Coast, but also Texas, Puerto Rico. So I think the sense you have about American art and just also Latino art is really kind of interesting, and you've been doing a lot of work with that. You ended up in California, at the Hammer Museum. People, in another video we have with Andrea Junta, we addressed this exhibition of radical women that was also curated with Cecilia Fajardo-Gil. But you were involved early on in that exhibit. Can you tell us a little bit about your role in that show and also other things that you remember from the Hammer years?
Yeah. So, now hindsight is always 2020. And so luckily, I guess I can see an arc to my career and how one job informs the other. And, I kept growing. And that's the beauty of what we do, right? And to see how we're growing and learning more and more. And so from Houston and the MFAH and reading so many documents and knowing, kind of having a really robust base and foundation for these different art histories, I went to the Hammer to work on this exhibition, Radical Women, with Andrea Junta and Cecilia Fajardo-Gil. And what was interesting about that experience, that fellowship, was that I knew that I was going to be exposed to all the different facets of making an exhibition. So when I started, because Radical Women, along with a bunch of other exhibitions, were part of this Pacific Standard Time initiative funded by the Getty, I started at the point where the Getty had given museums a research grant. And so it was that moment to think about the framework for your exhibition, assemble a group of scholars. That was really important for the Getty, not to assume that one single curator knew everything about Latin American or Latinx art, but that it was the product of many minds coming together. So we were thinking about who that advisory board was going to be, thinking about the catalog, what essays we were going to have, who we're going to invite to write. That was really nice to have that experience, and knowing that I had just come from the ICA in Houston. I knew first and foremost who the artists, who the scholars we were talking to, and we had to talk to. I also helped them with the research on Caribbean art and that region of the world. And then eventually, about a year and a half later, the Getty gave us the implementation grant. So that was the money to bring works from all over different countries for the shipping, the crating, framing, think about the exhibition design, basically all of the production that you need in order to make an exhibition. I want to stress how important it is, and probably we have people listening to us who are interested in a curatorial career, which can be so kind of obscure and kind of strange and hermetic. Like, what is it that curators do? Because when you go to museums, you see a work and it's so pristine almost and so perfectly hung, and there's just one label, but you don't see all the work that's behind. And these fellowships really prepared me to understand what every single step it is that you have to make and take in order to make an exhibition.
And, also by working with people like Andrea and Cecilia, and you had already worked with Monica, there's this kind of multi-generational dialogue happening, right? Through these multi-year processes.
Exactly. Yeah.
Fast forward a few years and you've ended up in New York, where you still are working at the Whitney Museum. At this institution, you've done all kinds of really important exhibitions in a wide range of topics. So perhaps, we could start with, the Supremacy exhibit, which is a smaller one, but I think it's good for people to know that you also work with individual artists sometimes, you know? So can you tell us a little bit about that show?
Yeah, so that was great working with Martin Gutierrez on this billboard project that we do across the street from the museum. We have a billboard that we commission artists, especially emerging artists, to create a billboard. And in the case of Martine, she created this incredible image of herself wearing lingerie, and it was on top of a store called Intermix, kind of a fashion, brand. But it was funny how I think people might have been confused for that billboard being an ad for the store. But we wanted that kind of almost like indexicality of the billboard referencing the store, referencing lingerie, referencing Martine as a model. Martine is a trans woman, an activist who often talks about how, especially with a project she did called Indigenous Woman, which was a 130-something page magazine that she made. And when I say she made it, she literally did everything. She was the model, the photographer, the artistic director, the writer, the stylist, the makeup artist. It was an agency. It was really literally agency of her saying, if I'm and other trans women are not in fashion magazines, I'm gonna make my own fashion magazine. And so by making this billboard where she's wearing this lingerie, she's laying down and there's a bunch of Barbie dolls pulling her hair, pulling her lingerie, pulling her skin. And these ideals of beauty, which are so white, so blonde, kind of trying to unravel this woman of color and then calling the brand supremacy. It's very tongue-in-cheek, very Martine. And from the billboard, of course, we started talking about a performance, which we do more here, and we've started doing. We have a curator of performance art, Adrian Edwards, and so, but it's always kind of testing a little bit the institution on ways of working in different ways and new ways. And so Martine did this incredible performance at the Whitney where she created like a board, either a corporate board, a museum board, a board with a bunch of male people who were part of the board, and she was like commanding them, and yeah, she was the boss.
There's a relationship between billboards and kind of advertising and the history of muralism, So I think as public art, right? Mm-hmm. It's public art taken over by corporate language and so on. But you also at the Whitney early on were involved in this Vida Americana exhibit, right? Mm-hmm. Which was thinking of how Mexican muralists remade, American art. We won't spend too much time there, but can you tell us about what that experience was like working in muralism and then older period, which was not necessarily contemporary,
Right. Yeah. That was a show that my colleague Barbara Haskell had been working on for many, many years. I think by the time we opened the show, it had been maybe 10 years. And because pre-war, pre-Second World War is kind of her area, and she knows that period, especially the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, regional art very well. I think, like curators, we pick up on things that maybe haven't been visually seen. And so we make scholarship in that way. And even though I think the impact of the muralists in the US had been well documented, of course, Diego Rivera coming to the US to make different murals, the Rockefeller mural, that had been known, but how to create that visual story of how having, the Rockefeller mural, for example, and then a couple years later, the WPA, create those visual links was important. And so Barbara, having known this area, this period so well, it was really interesting that she pitched this show, which in essence is a rebuke of American exceptionalism. When we learn, especially in the US, contemporary art, we start with Jackson Pollock, almost like, this genius was born and then, voila, we have modern art. And so she dug deeper and, shown how the Mexican artists, Los Tres Grandes, when they came to the US, which is interesting, right? Because they were accepting these commissions by uber capitalists. And then somehow that got funneled into American artists making art for the people.
Siqueiros literally was a Stalinist getting money from these capitalists.
Exactly. It's like the contradictions, which
continue to our days.
Absolutely. I was just going to say that.
I think one thing that interests me a lot of your, exhibition history is that almost every project really challenges our understanding of American, what American means, you know? So for example, with muralism, we're talking like Vida Americana. It's a kind of new look at what the continent means versus not just the US as a country, you know? And but after that, you did an exhibit where indigeneity was kind of what challenged it. You know, it's Pacha, Yacta, Wasichai, right? These terms that you're referring to. Can you tell us a little bit about how you chose the title for that exhibition and what the main ideas were and what you learned from it?
When in doubt, listen to artists. That would be my bumper sticker and my motto in life. And that was really the first show I did at the Whitney. You know that you're coming into an institution with a long history as the first Latina curator, so many different groups, so many millions of people looking up to you. It's like the pressure, it's quite a lot, to be totally frank. And so I was debating what my first show was going to be, whether it was going to be a survey of a mid-career or an older, more established artist, or a group show or an emerging artist kind of show. And I remember talking to Thelma Golden early on when I started, and she said that she felt the same kind of pressure when she was curator at the Whitney, and that she decided to work for her first show with artists of her generation. And I thought, oh, okay, that makes total sense. And that is something that feels very genuine to me as someone who, because of these different movements and moving from one city to city, I've created these networks of people, and I have talked to artists, from when they were starting kind of right after the MFA programs, and now it's 5-7 years later. And I've continued those conversations with artists. And so if I stop to think what these conversations and were kind of the zeitgeist and what the art that they're making, and if there's an affinity across, especially Latinx artists, I noticed that a lot of them were grappling with notions of architecture and space in general, inspired by different indigenous groups throughout the Americas and their diasporas in the US. I had done a little video explaining one of Rafa Esparza's work in the Made in LA biennial when I was in LA. I had talked to him about that. I knew what Gala Porrasquin was doing. I knew of Beatriz Cortez's work. All of these artists who were also kind of starting to orbit around the Whitney. But I had these conversations going back to my years in Houston with Clarissa Towson and Ronnie Quevedo, especially like in the case of Clarissa, how she was working with Frank Lloyd Wright. She's always been an artist where architecture plays an important role. And whether it's Niemeyer or Frank Lloyd Wright, these kind of modernist architects. And in the case of Frank Lloyd Wright, how his houses were this pastiche of different, what for him became motifs, decorative elements from Maya temples. And so kind of the quoter was really interesting, and how one could speculate how those temples, how those pyramids or spaces had been used many, centuries ago. And that became really interesting of how, these contemporary Latinx artists are not looking necessarily to quote or to the canon of modernist architecture, but thinking more about the frictions that exist between indigenous architecture and notions of space and modernism. When that kernel became kind of the idea, then I started doing other studio visits with other artists like Guadalupe Maravilla, whose Tripachuca works on paper, using motifs from the codex, the Tolteca Chichimeca, which were migrant groups, resembled so much his own history as a migrant coming from El Salvador all the way to the US when he was 8 years old, and how his works on paper, by playing this game Tripachuca, look and appear as maps that are worth saving, are worth showing, are worth telling the history, because these are the epics that our migrant communities, our migrant people in the US are living through. I think that group show was interesting because every single artist had a very specific narrative, a very specific story, a very specific kind of way of dealing with the frictions between architecture and indigenous spaces. In the exhibition design, I think we well accomplished not mixing them together, not confusing them, not necessarily what in other shows you might want to create sight lines between works and connections, but wanting to really give them their own space. And so when thinking about the title for that show, it felt very problematic to use the word architecture because such a concept and term loaded with Western epistemology that it felt wrong. And so, taking a hint from the artists themselves, like William Cordova, Jorge Gonzalez, even Ronnie Quevedo, Clarissa Tozin, of quoting the different groups that they're working with through their art, but also calling attention to the fact that, when we talk about the Americas, it's not only English, Spanish, Portuguese, or even French, but there are other indigenous languages, not just spoken in, say, the Andes, but also in the US to kind of call attention to these new diasporas.
In terms of your own personal background, eventually you did also arrive there making a show at the Whitney that is not about the Caribbean more broadly speaking, but touches on it. And it's not only about Puerto Rico, but also the environmental situation that we live in globally, right? So can you kind of tell us how the Un Mundo Post-Huracán happened, where we know there was the Maria, the hurricane disaster that many people will still remember years later. But how did you think of making an exhibition from this point of view?
It's interesting because while working on Pacha, the hurricane happened. So we're always, our brains are split in different exhibitions at different stages. And so when I started at the Whitney, I started April 2017. This is a longer story, but I was pregnant. And then my child was born in August 2017. And so my parents were here for her birth. My dad eventually went back to Puerto Rico. So I'm home with an infant, with my mother. These kind of now in retrospect, these 3 generations in a house watching this disaster happen mediated through our computers, and the disconnect, the horror, right, of your entire world, and when being kind of turned upside down was really shocking, obviously, and that got me thinking. I get a little emotional when talking about
That's okay.
But yeah, it got me thinking about kind of catastrophes and tragedies and how art deals with that. So I knew that, especially a place like New York that is, knows very well really horrific events, and the arts will never cease to exist. The arts will always be there as a vehicle for, for different emotions, to cry, to laugh, to, the arts will always be there. And so I'm stuck at home with this infant, trying to get in touch with my family, with my friends, sending money, which is what I could do at the moment, sending food. I remember we sent food, which was like, food, but you were doing whatever you could. But I thought, okay, what platforms do I have? What can I leverage in my life to contribute positively to this event that will transform the history of Puerto Rico? And because my life is to work with artists, to carry out their vision, to show especially artists who are not as well known as, say, more iconic artists like Pollock or Liechtenstein or Hopper, but to give a platform to artists who traditionally wouldn't have access to platforms like the Whitney. I thought, well, let's see what happens. Let's see how artists deal with this moment. I wasn't interested in doing an exhibition that was about literal depictions of the hurricane, because that felt to me too didactic, too obvious perhaps. But I knew that artists were somehow going to process this moment and talk about not just the hurricane, but the human disaster it was. And I started noticing right after that, in terms of the arts, poets were the first ones to start thinking and processing their feelings through poetry. And a lot of poets were publishing poems, were translating each other's poems, were self-publishing. And in 2019, someone gave me a book of poems by Roque Raquel Salas Rivera, but there was a line that says, no existe un mundo pos huracán. And that swirled in my mind of, there isn't, because we're already in this moment. Or maybe we can just say that it doesn't exist because we're going to create a new one. And so it just made me think about it from different directions to unpack that. And I thought, I asked Raquel if I could borrow his verse for the title of the show. And he said yes. And once he said yes, I said, okay, I have a show here. And one thing I wanted to signal with that verse was that, when you came to the Whitney to see that show, you were going to see a show about poetry. You weren't going to see a show about disaster, that it was going to be highly nuanced. And so there were 20 artists in the exhibition. It happened 5 years after the hurricane. Which is kind of an important way in which I think we all mark our lives or think about our lives. Like, what was I doing 5 years ago? What am I going to be doing 5 years from now? And so it was a kind of important moment to take stock of what had happened. So I invited 20 artists of all different mediums. 11 of them lived in Puerto Rico and the other 9 lived in the diaspora. That was also important because if there was an event that brought Puerto Ricans from the island and the diaspora together, was Hurricane Maria. It showed that when, your local government and your federal government are not there, or are there and they're gaslighting you, it's the people. It's that bridge that many artists and scholars have talked about and writers have talked about that connects us constantly because we're so close. That was important to have both groups of artists. The exhibition was divided into 5 sections. But what's important to emphasize about these 5 sections is that all the works could be, I guess, in dialogue with each other, but you had different moments. You had the moments where, very specifically speak about lack of resources, lack of power, both in the metaphorical sense, but also literal sense of having no electricity, to the closing of schools, which was happening, to the selling of lands, to coastal erosion, to the deaths that happened because of Maria, and then leading all the way to the 2019 ouster of the governor back then. And so in all of these permutations and ways to think about these 5 years, you could see all of these different emotions, like a tapestry of rage, of frustration, of sadness, of grief, but also joy in seeing nature come back again, in working with your neighbor to bring food to a person, working together, like in the embroideries of Lulu Barona, even in those posters that we had at the end of the show by Garvin Sierra, where you could see very biting humor, and then in the comments of the people, because he published them on Instagram, people laughing, of people encouraging him to continue. So I think that was important. It wasn't just a show. I think it made many people cry. It makes me cry every time I talk about it. But I think that's also important. I think museums should do that, should be spaces of catharsis and, to express emotions.
Yeah, no, and I remember in terms of what you're saying, when I saw the show, I was really struck by that first video, which was projected very large, but had a rawness that you rarely get to see in videos that they're projected, Yeah. And so there was a big range of things that felt raw and immediate, and things that you could see the years of work, and but ultimately what you were saying also, the necessity of art, that art gets made especially in these dire circumstances, right?
Yeah.
Because too many people think the opposite, that art is not necessary in times of,
Right. Yeah.
when it's the opposite. Can you tell us also about the exhibit Shifting Landscapes, and how that came about and what its
Yeah.
subject matter is?
Yeah. Shifting Landscapes was my first show made entirely of works from the collection. So the Whitney Museum has 27,000 objects in the collection. It's a huge collection. The seventh floor is a space dedicated to our collection from early 20th century all the way to 1960s, maybe 1970s. And then on our sixth floor, the floor just below it, we use that space, that floor, to organize exhibitions with works from the collection from the 70s to the present, but organized along a thematic concept or idea. And so we've had several shows that are up for a long time that cover one idea that you can really explore through our collection. We moved to this new building in 2015. And so the show opened almost 10 years after the museum had moved. And so we had made incredible impact in the collection of acquiring works by artists from historically marginalized communities. And I personally had, because I've been at the Whitney now 7+ years, I've brought a lot of works together. And I think that's why I was part of this curatorial team that organized Shifting Landscapes. And so with the team, with the curators together, we were thinking, okay, so we have all these new works. What are some of the ideas that artists are working with? What can we tease out that works in common between all of these artists, all of these new works? And immediately notions of place, world making, the land started to emerge. And all of these different ideas kind of led to the theme of landscape. So sometimes when I talk about the show, I say that if you look at our collection, you will get at least 7 definitions of what the landscape is. And I say at least 7 because in Shifting Landscapes, there were 7 sections, 7 different versions of these different landscapes. We also like the concept of landscape because it's a word that works in so many different ways. It's one of the first terms you learn in Art History 101, the landscape. And American art, you might think of romantic scenes and vistas of the Hudson River School. But currently, and you might think of the political landscape, which is another kind of version, right, of that term. Or in contemporary art, you might think of what is the landscape of art. And so we wanted to kind of use those shorthands that people have to kind of use it as an opening and say, okay, this is what you think a landscape is. This is what, if you look at the Whitney's collection as a lens, then you will get these other different versions that you perhaps might not be expecting.
Mm-hmm. The Whitney is, not just nationally, but internationally known for its biennial, and you'll be curating the next edition. Can you tell us briefly, how you're thinking about it, framing it,
Yeah, I'm doing the biennial with Drew Sawyer, who's a curator at the Whitney. We're both kind of in the early stages. A question that we get often is whether you start with a theoretical or conceptual framework, or you start doing studio visits and seeing, again, where artists lead you. And so no surprise, we are starting with the latter. So we're doing a lot of studio visits, especially with artists with whom we haven't visited or that we haven't visited before, that we're very excited. We were very curious about these artists' practices. And this is kind of the best opportunity to talk to them and ask them what they're working on right now. I think that right now is also really important when it comes to biennials, and not necessarily bring back works just to fit an idea. And maybe that will change. Maybe once we have the conceptual underpinnings of the show, it's a very specific kind of exhibition it's a much bigger group show, of course. But when you have so many artists, we've talked to other curators is whether it's possible to have a concept that really brings them all together. So we're kind of in the process of finding out that. But yeah, we're enjoying the freedom to just be curious, to listen to artists, of not having to make any decisions. So that's a very specific phase of the biennial, of curating the biennial, and we're enjoying that a lot.
In the early stages when you were in Houston, right?
Yeah.
Working as a research coordinator there at the museum. And how do you feel that experience of kind of running research influenced your practice as a curator?
Yeah, that was a great experience in the sense that I had just defended my dissertation proposal at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So I was having real questions about my future, and knowing that I was writing this dissertation on Caribbean art that probably didn't really have a market in terms of art history fields of specialty. And, when I was looking at, what was out there in terms of career opportunities, I didn't see anyone. Maybe there was the beginning stages of some universities looking for someone with expertise in African diasporic art, but not necessarily Caribbean art or even Latin American art. But I didn't have that background in Latin American art, so I felt a little bit like a fish out of water, about to start writing a dissertation that wasn't going to have kind of any career opportunity. So I thought, let me look into job opportunities in museums. And I saw this a great opportunity at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, working with Mari Carmen Ramirez in the Latin American department of that museum. And Mari Carmen is not only an incredible curator who has put Latin American art on the map of US museums and art in general, but she also was running the International Center for the Arts of the Americas. And they were looking for a research coordinator. And I thought, this is kind of the best of both worlds. And this is kind of really what I was looking for. I knew how to do research, but I was going to have a foot in museums and in a curatorial department. And it was the best decision at that juncture in my life. It also revealed to me, because I was working at what we call the ICA or the ICAA, that there were other modes of instruction and pedagogy, and which I think is very relevant to this conversation, because whereas I didn't have that background in Latin American art or Latino art, Latinx art, by working with Mari Carmen at the ICA, and my job was really like reading primary and secondary documents, materials that I hadn't been exposed to in grad school, let alone undergrad, and seeing all this, it really opened up a new world for me. And some, jokingly, I say that the 3 years that I worked there were kind of another master's on top of the masters that I already had. And it had really exposed me to not only the different avant-garde movements that were happening throughout the 20th century in Latin America and in the US, but also specifically in the US, all the different groups that define who a Latino, Latina, Latinx person is, and how there are obviously differences in terms of demographics throughout the US, but also our historians who are dedicating their lives to reading, and writing and making scholarship about their specific group. So it was really a big picture of what was happening hemispherically, in between the US and Latin America.
Yeah.